Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Hour of History podcast. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and we're delighted to have you back. This week, I have Dr. David Mislin with me. We're talking all sorts of things, 19th and 20th century U.S. religion, culture, and politics. Dr. Mislin is a professor at Temple University, and he's doing some really cool things with his research, and I think you're going to find this conversation absolutely fascinating like I did. Thanks again for listening to Hour of History. You can always get more great content, especially links to the works by the authors. You can support them, and you can get suggestions from them to learn more at hourofhistory.com. hourofhistory.com/Rex has the recommendations from all the episodes. Really, that's all you need in one place. Thank you so much for listening. And on Hour of History, it's our world anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world, anytime, any place.
With your host, Stephen Bauman, and producer, James Albel. The Hour of History is a member of Episodic Network, an association of fun, interesting, and informative podcasts. EpisodicNetwork.com. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
So I'm here with Dr. David Mislin, and I'm really excited because, a few months back now, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes Alvarez, she said, I really enjoyed talking to you, but you have to go talk to David Mislin. So welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, if you're listening.
Hopefully she is. So now you are a professor at Temple University and you're working with 19th and 20th century U.S. religion. Can you tell us, I'm always really interested when I meet people who study religion because it's a very interesting sort of topic matter to get into. So could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, well, I actually had studied U.S. religion in grad school for about 4 or 5 years before it kind of clicked with me just how much of my work and my interest was probably shaped by my background. My mom is a United Church of Christ minister, actually, so I kind of grew up in this world of mainline liberal U.S. Protestantism, sort of really heavily influenced by the social gospel tradition and all of that. And I sort of grew up kind of the preacher's kid being around churches. And so I got really interested in studying the history of American religion, but it never really kind of connected until I was quite a ways into my first project, how much maybe my own background had shaped my interest in this.
So were you studying religion or what were you studying? Where were you doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was all over the place. I was a history major as an undergrad, and then basically, I think maybe like a lot of people, it was suddenly my senior year of college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I didn't really want to get a job. I didn't really want to leave school. And I was sort of interested in history, but then in my junior and senior year at college, I started taking some religion classes. And so I thought, well, maybe I was interested in that. So I got accepted to the master's degree program at Harvard Divinity School. And I literally changed my major there 3 times in the first year. First, I was sort of really interested in like religion and contemporary politics. Then I kind of got this really crazy idea that what I really wanted to do was like be a biblical scholar, and I was going to like study the Hebrew Bible, which lasted for like all of 2 weeks until someone pointed out to me that I didn't know Hebrew, and it was probably a little bit late to start. So anyway, then like I ended up sort of putting everything together. I was interested in history. I was interested in religion in the U.S. And so my second year, I like calmed down and took a bunch of American religious history classes with Bob Orsi, who was there then, Heather Curtis, who's now at Tufts. I took a couple of really wonderful classes with her. And so then I decided I wanted to do a PhD program. I've always felt more comfortable in terms of academic discipline in history departments than religious studies departments. So I went back to history, but U.S. religion has been my focus pretty much all the way through.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating and dynamic field. And like with your background, and your mom being a minister and just having these interactions between history and religious studies, you get people from all over the place, right?
Yeah, that's really true, and it's been particularly advantageous to me in my current job at Temple in the Intellectual Heritage Program, which is really about as multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary an environment as you can teach in. Historians, people from religious studies, people from philosophy, literature, creative writing. It's really interesting. It's helped my teaching a lot. It's helped my scholarship to kind of be in, as you say, what is such a dynamic field.
It's very cool. And so your book that came out, Saving Faith, Making Religious Pluralism an American Value at the Dawn of the Secular Age. And you look at the sort of like the end of the 19th century through the early 20th century, but you get these really captivating preachers and ministers and stuff like that. But you kind of flip that idea that religious people are unchanging conservatives in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think what you just said is exactly right. This is the moment in U.S. history when theological liberalism and progressive politics really kind of get wedded together in the mainline denominations, and really there's this liberal takeover of a lot of U.S. Protestant churches. And so I write about two generations of clergy in the book. And the first generation are these people who grow up kind of at the tail end of the Second Great Awakening, but very much in this kind of 19th century revival, evangelical culture. And, as they're growing up, they assume the world is always going to be like that. But as they enter adulthood, they kind of see things like the theory of evolution calling into question human origins. They see, new biblical scholarship seeming to call a lot of the assumptions about the Bible into question. And so all of a sudden, they're adults in the society where atheism and agnosticism are popular alternatives, and there's immigration. And so all of a sudden there are Catholics and Jewish immigrants and, to a lesser degree, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, all arriving in the US. And it creates something of a crisis of faith for them. And what I try to chronicle in the book is the process by which a lot of these people kind of reformulated their expectations of religion, and in the hopes of trying to sustain some religious quality to American life, they ended up kind of embracing this ideal of religious pluralism and arguing that actually the nation's religious diversity was one of its greatest strengths.
And it's such a dynamic kind of moment in American history too, where you have like the expansion of industry and like the fabulous wealthy and the working class immigrants and all these different religions. The sort of Congress of Religions. It's in Chicago. Is that time period special, or do you see some of that reflected in the present day?
Oh, I think like every time I read the news, it's like it's something else. It's really funny that I have wished. So the book came out in the September of 2015, and one of my wishes has kind of been that I had waited like another 9 or 12 months. It was my dissertation turned book. So on the one hand, I was so happy to be done with it, but I do think it would have been a very different book if I'd written it, 9, 12 or 18 months later, because so many of the issues that the people I write about in the 19th and 20th century, so many of the issues they were facing are issues, as you said, that we're really facing right now, rampant income inequality, a sense that kind of wealth is being consolidated while a lot of the rest of society is being left behind, anxieties about immigration, more even just fundamental anxieties. What does it mean to be an American? What is the meaning of American culture? These were the things that the people I write about were really grappling with in their own time. And I think I was aware when I wrote the book that obviously these were issues we were grappling with as well as a society, but I don't think, in 2013, 2014, early 2015, as I was revising the dissertation into a book, it hadn't quite become as apparent just how central those issues are to our current politics.
And it's always kind of fascinated me that this turn of the century, it's just out of generational reach. So we can kind of talk to people who were there 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's not the same. Was that a conscious decision on your choice? How did you choose the time period?
That's a really interesting question. It just I think it just sort of happened, and the bookends of the project moved around a lot. I've always been really interested in, especially the 1920s and the 1930s. I think for the reasons you said, culturally it was different but accessible. Even my great-grandmother, who died when I was in high school, but she was born in 1903. And so I remember hearing stories of her childhood and adolescence, and I felt like I could sort of picture a little bit the world that my subjects were living in by World War I or by the 1920s. But I think the project just kind of naturally moved backwards, and a lot of the issues that the people I write about were starting to really resolve, or think they were resolving, after about 1900, were issues they were really struggling with, particularly in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. So for me, there was kind of a narrative arc to that, even though really, the more I've studied this period, the more convinced I've become that the world of the 1870s and the 1880s is very different from the world of the 1910s and the 1920s.
Yeah, it is interesting because some things seem to be, never sort of resolved. One of the things that you do really well in the book, and I think is, maybe, I don't know if this would be an interesting question, if it's because of your background or whatnot, but you seem to be able to access this conflict of biblical truth that all these people kind of struggle with, that seems to still be an issue. Just looking through the Bible, and your book is far better at quoting it than I ever would be, but that sort of these preachers are coming to, or these ministers are coming to terms with, well, some of this stuff isn't true, and it was written later, and stuff was added in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's one of the things that's really interesting to me is to my reading, actually, how easily they made that shift. And I think that's maybe one of the interventions I'd like to hope that my book makes, is there were a lot of things that these ministers struggled with. I think the kind of changing religious landscape of the United States was one of them. But they actually, to my reading, made the shift fairly quickly from kind of expecting the Bible to be inerrant, to be without error, to actually just sort of being able to admit, okay, some things aren't true. And I think it was because there were enough things for them that mattered that were still true. So, one of the things I talk about a lot in the book, there was this phrase that got invoked a lot, starting in the late 19th century. And that was the phrase, the person of Jesus, being the essence of Christianity. As a historian, this has really been kind of a source of frustration for me, because everybody used this phrase. Everything I read about used this phrase, and really not a single person ever defined it particularly usefully. It wasn't just Jesus's message. It was somehow like Jesus's self-understanding of, himself as the Son of God. I mean, nobody ever really explained what they meant. But, for them, this concept of the person of Jesus sort of became the essence of Christianity, and it became really easily agreed on essence of Christianity. And so because they had that, they were able to let a lot of other things go. They didn't need prophecies to be coming true in the Bible. They didn't need scripture to make historic or scientific sense. And it was a shift, I think, that generations after weren't able to make so easily. But for the people I write about, they actually kind of let go of a lot of their beliefs pretty readily.
It's interesting too with religion. I'm thinking of this now, like, I have the stuff I prepared, but this just popped into my mind. With religion, there's always this sort of like sense of presentism because a lot of these faiths still exist. Mm-hmm. So is that a challenge? Because you talk, in your book about the liberal Protestants forging connections and that sort of thing. And in a way, and the presentist mindset kind of comes right to my mind. And in a way, that same sort of thing is happening, but it seems like there's the whole other side too. Do you find yourself, like, as when studying religion, pulled into the present more so than maybe other historical studies that you've done?
Maybe. I mean, I guess where I most find myself pulled into the present with the work I do is there's such a historical narrative that's, I think, so deeply ingrained that people just assume it without even realizing they're doing that. And that is this assumption that the 20th century was essentially the story of the decline of these mainline liberal Protestant denominations. Starting maybe in the late 1920s or the 1930s, with the kind of resurgence of like neo-orthodoxy, but then certainly with the rise of the new evangelical right through the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so I think there's a lot of times the assumption when you're studying or writing about liberal Protestantism that basically on some level you're trying to explain what went wrong or why that decline happened. And so for me, I think the biggest challenge with my book was to try to set that aside a little bit and try to understand these people in their own world where that decline hadn't happened yet, and not sort of have the future history of liberal Protestantism constantly in my mind as I was researching and writing.
And how useful do you find a term like Protestant or Protestantism for defining these groups?
It's a really funny question because I've actually never gotten it before.
Awesome.
Usually the question I always get is like, how useful is the term mainline, or how useful is the term liberal? How useful is the term, David Hollinger uses the term ecumenical Protestants to describe the groups. And sort of the question is, is that a useful term? Protestant themselves, it's not a great term. They certainly didn't use it usually to describe themselves. Sometimes they used, especially in the 19th century, they used the term evangelical, which is just hugely problematic.
Another one, yeah.
But I mean, they thought of themselves as Christians, right? And so when they talked of themselves as being religious or believing in religion, believing in Christianity. They didn't really self-identify a lot as Protestants. From my perspective, it's a term of necessity. Obviously, they weren't the only religious people in the United States. Obviously, they weren't the only Christians in the United States. So as a as a scholarly shorthand, I think it's pretty essential. In the same way that I think a term like mainline or liberal, even though it's not a perfect term, is really a necessary term to try to signify where the boundaries are.
And maybe just a word about that. I know these are things people have written books and books and books on, but that's something that anyone who's writing early 20th century has to come across. How do you define, progressive, liberal, Protestant, all of these things? Like, did you have a sort of methodology? How did you come to a term that you could agree with on all these super controversial terms?
I wish I had a good answer for you. It was just actually kind of a case of I started using the terms because I needed to use something, and then kind of worked up the methodology later. Maybe that's not the best admission for a historian, but I think that's how we work a lot of the time. In terms of the word Protestant, it was, it's obviously it's what they were. So that was fairly easy. In terms of using mainline, that was actually something I debated with a lot of people, because it's a term that's more associated with the founding of the Federal Council of Churches and after, so sort of a product of the early and mid 20th century. But to me, it was useful as a way of grouping kind of the historic upper middle class denominations. So Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians are the big three I talk about in the book. The Disciples of Christ, to a lesser extent, some Baptists, some Methodists, particularly in urban areas, but these kind of old established denominations that kind of had some institutional layers to them. Theological seminaries that were well established, clergy who tended to be well educated. To me, that was sort of what mainline is a good signifier for. Sort of churches that sort of have connections to the establishment and have some institutional heft to them.
Now, did you find your time at the Divinity, because this is at post Divinity school, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Did you find that time sort of had a formative effect on your historical research later that you did at Boston?
Only in a very tangential way, in that, Harvard Divinity School is, to the extent that anyone is training for ministry there, which is, I think when I was there, not the majority of the student body. But it is kind of the embodiment of that kind of mainline ethos of the 20th century. So the people there who were in the Masters of Divinity program, who were planning to go into ministry, were still kind of very much a part of the intellectual tradition I was writing about. And so from that perspective, it was instructive that I actually had names and faces in my mind of people who actually were planning to go be ministers kind of in the mold with the mindset of the people I was writing about.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And maybe a word or two, more lighthearted question. How cool is Boston, a place to be for higher ed?
Oh, I love Boston. Philly has its many charms. Boston is fantastic. I don't think I could afford to live there anymore. I guess that's true of a lot of cities. I was really fortunate to be there for my master's, and then for my PhD, sort of right before the kind of worst of the kind of explosion in housing prices happened, because I was able to live in Cambridge, not far from Harvard Square, and it was a really fantastic place to be.
It's just so cool because, there's always a talk going on, and, the community, everyone's just, very cool.
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things that I found on your Temple website, so I don't know how responsible you are for this, but it said one of your area of expertise is evil. Can you, what is that about?
Well, so that's about the project that I have it in mind to write that I actually never can bring myself to like actually make a plan to do is kind of thinking about kind of the concept of evil and how it's been used in American religion over the last 100 or 150 years. Sort of a basic confession is that I started thinking about this right after I finished my PhD and I was getting Saving Faith ready. And partly it was just a reaction of I'd spent 6 or 7 years at that point researching a bunch of really optimistic Protestants who thought they were going to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth, who thought they were going to change the world, who thought everybody could just get along. And I was kind of just really tired of happiness. And that kind of early 20th century, if anyone listening has done any sort of research in the early 20th century, there's a particular kind of really sort of saccharine optimism during the progressive era, and it loses a little bit of its power with World War One, but then it comes back, and especially with the vantage point of history, and I don't want to judge people by events that they hadn't experienced, but it seems so naive in some ways. But I had spent like 6 or 7 years reading these kind of optimistic predictions of just a few more years and the world is going to be amazing. And so I wanted a new project that got as far away from that as I could. And I've worked on it periodically over the years, and I think, and I hope it will eventually be kind of something I turn my attention to full time, trying to sort of examine and explore what fundamentally like religious Americans have meant when they've used the term evil, when they've described things as evil.
Yeah, and I think that would be like a really interesting. I mean, it catches the eye, evil, and it's something that we use it so often, but I feel like it must have been a much deeper thing at some point.
Yeah. Well, I hope at some point there is a book and you can have me back on. It is something I'm really interested in, but the obvious problem is that it's such an unwieldy topic. I've not been able to bring myself to like figure out how to like make it manageable.
It is interesting, and we have now we're getting like very historian centric on this podcast, and it will open up, but I'm enjoying it, so I'm going to keep going. One of the things that historians tend to do is, we have a lot of projects going along the way that we want to work on, but we might not have time now. But one thing that really helps that, at least in my experience, is sharing with others and teaching with others. And I know you and Elizabeth, do a lot of teaching. Could you talk a little bit about what teaching has done for your research, or maybe just your experience teaching at Temple?
Well, my experience at Temple has been really absolutely fantastic. So just maybe, I don't know how much Elizabeth covered in the other podcast, but to say a little bit about what I teach in. I teach in something called the Intellectual Heritage Program, which is kind of in the tradition of a Great Books course or a core text curriculum. It's a 2-semester sequence that all undergrads at Temple are required to take, regardless of what their major is or what college they're in, with the idea that basically every student who attends Temple will have this experience of being exposed to kind of a collection of important historical texts. And everyone who teaches it a little bit differently, teaches some different books. It's, especially when I started, it's a really kind of daunting thing to teach because I have to teach ancient Greek philosophy. I have to teach some political theory that I just really didn't know all that well when I started. But one of the advantages of it, I mean, it's really fun just as, someone who wants to kind of have an intellectual life beyond my own narrow focus of research, it kind of lets me do that.
Hmm.
But it's also, I found, been really helpful, not so much with research, but with writing. Having students in my classes who are generally really wonderful, like intellectually curious folks, being able to think about them and what would happen if they picked up a book I wrote, or what would happen if I were trying to introduce my ideas to them. How would I go about doing that? It's really extraordinarily helpful in thinking about kind of the tone I use, the voice I use, how to pitch my writing to a broad audience. So it's been really helpful in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's like, that it's a really good thing to hear because, your teaching load is massive, and at the same time, you can still appreciate, and that's why it's so cool to talk to you guys, because Temple has a lot of the best intellectual heritage people, and you really appreciate it. But I think it does kind of change the perspective, and I think teaching's just such an important part, and you get a little selection, right? Because you still get to teach the things that are interesting to you.
Yeah, we do. There's some core texts in the courses. The Epic of Gilgamesh, some of Plato's writings, the Apology, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. But beyond that, we do get some choices. And for me, actually, one of the really fun things as I've gotten used to teaching the courses over the years has been actually finding ways to bring in research I'm doing into the classes and to connect it up to some of the stuff they're reading.
That's awesome. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so I actually, this semester, I've been just kind of a side project over the years, been looking at the way primarily liberal Protestants kind of talked about issues of human rights in the early part of the 20th century. And they didn't even really use the term human rights, but they talked a little bit about humanitarian causes, or sometimes crimes against humanity. One of the books on our list is Les Casas's account of the expulsion of the Indies, which I've taught a few times. So this semester what I did is I taught a little bit less of that than I've done in previous years, and I paired it with some of the archival sources I found from the early 20th century. And I was able to bring some of those into class, and we spent a week on this, and it was really interesting to kind of think about this as change over time. How have people tried to raise awareness or call attention to human suffering or human atrocities? What political mechanisms have people tried to use? And it was really interesting for me, and I hope that students appreciated it. And it's things like that I find actually, with a little bit of creativity, even with the heavy teaching load, my research and my teaching can build off of each other.
Yeah. And I think it's really good that people kind of hear this, because, there's all these perceptions of like what's happening at colleges, and people are being indoctrinated in higher ed and stuff like that. But the way you present it it's just so cool. I mean, they're reading a text like De las Casas, and at the same time, they're interacting with texts that haven't necessarily been interpreted yet. Mm-hmm. It's very cool. And so does this lead into the sort of new projects that you're working on, or what are you working on right now?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a new project that I'm really excited about. Kind of just came to me like out of the blue one day that I'd essentially been researching it and hadn't realized it. But I'm working on a project that tries to trace the history of religious liberalism in small town America from the kind of end of the 19th century up until I haven't decided yet. I was thinking it was going to be like, Vietnam and the civil rights movement. But then I just found a lot of really, really interesting stuff from the 1980s and the farm crisis. So I don't know, endpoint to be determined.
And so what is, I'm really fascinated by this because, well, for a few reasons. Like you said, I mean, I've already read your work and I think it's going to be pretty cool, the next one. But a small town America seems to be something that everyone should be studying.
Yeah, I think people are starting to. I guess, I feel like it's one of those things where we're sort of inundated, especially since the 2016 election. We're sort of inundated with information about small town America, but it's not really sort of rigorous. I feel like the same sorts of stereotypes just kind of get regurgitated back to us every week. And so the question I'm really interested in with this project is, what does it mean to be someone who kind of has religiously liberal values? So, in the case of my Protestants, from the first book, that, people who don't take the Bible literally, or sort of willing to give up aspects of the Bible sort of in favor of reconciling their faith with modern society, people who are really sort of committed to social action with progressive causes. My guiding question is, so what does it mean to be that person and live in a small town? And one of the things I've been really interested to find, now that I've been kind of looking through archives methodically for this, there were actually a lot of these people through the 20th century in various parts of the country, and their stories have really been kind of overlooked. So I'm hoping to recapture that a little bit.
And now, did you grow up in a small town?
I grew up mostly kind of on the outskirts of Albany, New York. So I think probably it would be considered an exurb, but not really a small town. I don't have any sort of biographical connection to small towns. Only I think maybe like a lot of people have a sort of very romanticized notion of them, and so they're
and that's kind of like the fascinating thing about small towns, isn't it, though? Because I taught in China, I taught English, and I taught in what was a small Chinese, town is a bit unfair, it was a small Chinese city of 4 million. It would be huge in America, but for the Chinese it was kind of like, this is not a significant city.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I was going to say, it's interesting to hear you say that, because unlike my comment earlier where I was saying that I kind of started with the term and then figured out why, I've actually been really intentional of trying to define what a small town is. And, have what I think is a working definition, but it is interesting to hear you say that, and, just how much perspective matters with something like that.
Yeah, and it's a problem we really get into with America because, by all means, I grew up in Visalia, California. It's 130,000 now, which is significant for East Coast small towns, but for a California small town, it's a small town. Mm-hmm. So yeah, how do you come to terms with that? Is it the culture that makes the small town, or is it the population? But what you're saying is kind of challenging that too, in saying that these people exist in small towns.
Yeah, I've been working kind of with a very rudimentary definition I've come up with for myself, which is basically under 20,000 people, more than 30 miles from a larger city, and something that kind of struck me in my research, but I think is important, towns that don't have a college or university. It's one of the things that actually became really apparent very early on. I was doing some research, I think it was in the Minnesota Historical Society, and I don't remember which college or which town it was, but there was this town that kind of at face value was the perfect small town. And I was going through the records of some organization there in the 20th century, and it was like it's one of those like archival moments that's just too good to be true. And I knew there was another shoe that was going to drop because, they were anti-war and they were like pro-civil rights and then like super pro-LGBT rights very early on. And it was like, this is incredible. Like, how has no one written about this place? And then sort of 10 minutes later, like it occurred to me there's a small liberal arts college there. And it completely explained everything. So I think there's actually a really interesting different story to be told about small college towns. But I mean, for my purposes, I'm trying to look at places that don't have the complicating factor of a major academic institution.
Now, one thing I think about when I think of, and of course, listeners should keep in mind that this is, a project that's very much in development. But when I think of small towns, I think of like a sort of homogenous religious population.
Mm-hmm.
Is that consistent? Do religions kind of settle towns, or are you finding small towns that are diverse religiously?
Well, I mean, they're definitely diverse in terms of the number of Protestant denominations in them, and they're diverse, especially what I'm seeing with some Midwestern towns, in terms of like which ethnic groups settled them, and if there were multiple ethnic groups, there's some diversity there. I will say this is a work in progress. One of the things I'm really determined to do with this project is to not have it be another book just about white liberal Protestants, which is what my first book was about. So I am really interested. I'm going to be spending some time this summer at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. I have something of a research plan outlined there, but I'm really sort of interested in seeing what does it mean to come from Reform Judaism and have a sort of liberal outlook from that perspective and live in a small Midwestern town. Minnesota especially has a kind of history of liberal Catholicism in the late 19th and early 20th century that I'm eager to get into a little bit more. So to the extent that I can find religious diversity in small towns, I'm really quite eager to explore it.
And do you find that like America is exceptional in this way? Because I mean, where else are you going to find that kind of diversity in small towns? I suppose, like I've studied a lot of Asia, India could be analogous because there's a lot of different religions, but do you find America to be exceptional, or is that just your background?
Yeah, I actually don't know. I wish I had a good answer to that. I fear a little bit that my hope of all this diversity in small towns might actually be a little bit aspirational for this project. I just going through finding aids, I found a few things that give me a little bit of hope, but I think probably there is a little bit more diversity in the United States in smaller towns than in Europe, just because there's more heterogeneity to the populations that settled the town. Unfortunately, my background sort of beyond the US and Europe is probably not sufficient that I could comment with any site elsewhere.
Yeah, it's just interesting because when I hear these things about like, even the small towns or the liberal Protestantism, I'm trying to think of like if there's any other sort of location on earth where all these sort of forces will be mixing. And it is kind of like, I mean, you travel the East Coast in the United States and you see state changes even still today that are kind of predicated by these differences. Did you start out studying American history, or was it religion?
I started out with, actually I just started as an undergrad. My degree is just in history, and I think probably I took more European history class. I don't remember offhand, but I think it might actually be that I took more European history classes than American history classes, in part because when I was in in undergrad was kind of the tail end of the wave of popular religion as a field, as a subfield of study, as a methodology of study in European history. And so I was able to take some really interesting classes. I think the scholarship on lived religion in the U.S. Had started to come out at that point, but it hadn't quite distilled down like to the college classroom in the same way yet.
And you mentioned a sort of like line that you're following on human rights. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What did human rights mean to these liberal Protestants, and what certain human rights are you focusing on as you go forward?
Well, so I've been focusing on the way Americans were framing sort of what they perceived as atrocities elsewhere in the world that required their intervention. So the impetus to the Spanish-American War with how Cuba was described, the situation in the Philippines after that, and then kind of a few other things, some of the anti-imperialist efforts in Africa, and then even just World War I and how Germany's actions were portrayed. This is something of a project that lacks coherence at this point. It was actually my first attempt to dip my toe into trying to do some research for the Evil Project. I was thinking, okay, where do you start? What about like acts of evil? It's been helpful for thinking about the concepts of evil, but it's also worked just as a more specialized topic, especially being able to bring it into the classroom.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I'm really curious about this evilness, and I'll be following as you go along. But
now I'm wishing I were working on that book and forget the small towns.
No, the small towns are fascinating too. But there is this, it is two sides of the same coin though, right? Because these people in the small town are somehow concerned, or, you're hypothesizing, maybe you'll find that they're concerned about this evil abroad. The evil seems to always be elsewhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, so one of my kind of working arguments for the kind of the overall book, I'm at this stage in the research where I have lots and lots of really interesting stories and examples to tell, but I'm sort of trying to figure out how to put those together in some sort of larger thread. But one of the things that I find interesting is that people in small towns have these very, very liberal political ideas, religious ideas in their own lives, in their own communities. But they are really kind of scared of and suspicious of, as you put it, like the rest of the world, even the rest of the country. And one of the things is a letter I found in Minnesota that really struck me was from a woman in a rural community who, by all accounts, everything she was doing kind of completely fits the bill of what we think of as liberal Protestantism. She sort of had a very kind of broad-minded view of scripture, of religious tradition, of other religions. She was active in the social life, with social concerns, social activism in her community. But I found a letter from her to a national organization. This is from the 1950s, and she was saying that, basically everyone involved with the larger national organization, she was convinced they were all communists. She didn't have anything to do with them, and she thought this was completely terrible. The national organization, its leaders thought the same thing she did.
Wow.
So one of my kind of working hypotheses for this book is that part of the reason we don't see this history of small town religious liberalism, we don't talk about it, is that small town liberals in a lot of ways were their own worst enemies, because they were really suspicious of outside institutions and larger institutions. And so they never had they never were willing to join up with the larger movements, the larger institutions that would have kind of perpetuated that small town liberalism.
Hmm. Hey, that's, I'm just thinking so many things as you say this. It is really fascinating because I study Quakers and the same sort of thing, like they always get skepticism, oh,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to help the Indian famine. And the kind of response is always like, aren't there like Rajas in India? Shouldn't they have money? Why should I have to give money kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I never trace it through the other end where like, who is this person sending the letter? It's absolutely fascinating. Is there a danger that historians lose the small towns? Do you find that in the works you've read that small towns are underrepresented?
I think it's not that they're underrepresented. I think they're a little bit kind of flattened and maybe stereotyped in a way. I
Mm,
think this is a overly like flattened, stereotyped, simplistic statement in itself, but I do think, particularly with American religion, we tend to kind of read the history of small towns in the 20th and 21st centuries through the lens of the Scopes trial. It's
uh,
sort of had that image of the kind of closed-minded, anti-progress, anti-intellectual, anti-science small town um, in so much of what we do. So I think we write about them. I think we talk about them, but I think we just sort of assume that they're not liberal. They're
mm.
bastions of fundamentalism and things like that.
And that kind of continues on even to the present day, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually more so now. One of the reasons I've been kind of motivated to write this book at this particular moment is I think, especially since the 2016 election, we have now such a stereotyped view of what small towns are that I think it would actually be instructive, not just for historians, but hopefully for a broader segment of people who are interested in kind of American life, to kind of know about this history of religious liberalism in small towns and recognize that ideas that have flourished in New York City or Boston have also flourished in towns of 2,000 people in southwestern Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I hope you publish this and keep going with it. Um, but I'm kind of like I feel like there's such a divide right now. I'm a little bit pessimistic. Like the way people talk about small town. Now I have personal experience in small town, so like I kind of think you're really onto something here. But a lot of people I meet, especially in these big cities on the East Coast, seem to discount the small towns right away. And do you find that to be true, especially since you're very active online, you're very, you're engaged with the world. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, absolutely. And where I really actually find it to be true is in teaching. And in fact,
Mm.
so much so that I'm thinking of actually proposing a kind of course just on small town America, because teaching at a place like Temple, there's so much. You have students who are from Philly, from New Jersey, from the sort of East Coast cities and suburbs, who have kind of such a stereotyped vision of what rural Pennsylvania is like. And then you have students from rural Pennsylvania or
Yeah.
rural, upstate New York, who I think in a lot of cases come to Temple wanting to get away from that. So, maybe they sort of themselves would appreciate sort of knowing this richer, broader history of
Hmm.
what small towns have been and what they've accomplished.
Yeah, it's a great point. I once had a student describe herself as from Pentucky
Yeah, yeah,
to uproarious laughter, you know?
yeah, yeah. And it's really true. And I think, and I should say, I don't want to overstate my case here, right? A lot of small towns are religiously conservative places, right? I have no delusions with this project of sort of claiming that actually all small towns are really liberal. Nobody's ever noticed it. It's not that. These are places that sort of have a lot of, are very grounded in traditional morals, sort of, traditional values, kind of a conservative Christianity. And I don't think there's getting around that. But I also think there have been moments where there are counter narratives about those places that are worth acknowledging as well.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and I can't wait to see what you do with that. Unfortunately, we're drawing near to the end of the hour of history. We get to the point, though, fortunately, where listeners get to hear our suggestions. So we make one suggestion. It can be anything under the sun. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, okay. Well, this is probably not as creative as some people have been, but I have been, for the last few months, reading, kind of rediscovering Rex Stout's Nero Wolfe mysteries. I cannot recommend those enough to people in the audience who, either just like kind of mid-20th century detective fiction. It's really kind of fantastic in that genre. But also, especially the earlier ones, Rex Stout published these from the 1930s, I think into the 70s, certainly into the 60s. But the ones from the 30s and 40s are really kind of a fantastic lens into New York City and kind of what cities were imagined to be in the 30s, 40s, and also the narrator is someone tying this all together, who's from a small town in Ohio. So getting that kind of perceived cultural difference of New York. So a book suggestion for me that's not history, but kind of a wonderful lens into history.
That is very cool. I like these kind of novels, and I've never heard of this, so I'm like kind of embarrassed. I'm definitely going to take your suggestion up. I'm going to suggest a book too that's not at all related to our conversation, though all the suggestions from the conversation will be at hourofhistory.com. I'm going to suggest Haruki Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, which I've been re-listening to. I listened to this years ago, and it's like just sort of an autobiographical memoir. But listening to Murakami, who's now a very accomplished author, talk about his writing process and how it relates to kind of running and just getting up every day and doing it has been really inspiring to me. So I think a lot of people could grow from this. So that's my suggestion. And I'm definitely going to check out these Rex Stout books. Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the listeners?
Well, I will just say that I am, as you said, on social media. I'm at Twitter, or I'm on Twitter at Mislin. Especially if anyone is a Rex Stout fan, I would love to. Happy to talk about things other than history and politics on Twitter. So get in touch.
Perfect. And we will have the links to that at hourofhistory.com. Thank you so much. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Have a good one.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check out hourofhistory.com/Rex for all the recommendations mentioned during the show. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, be sure to head over to our blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, where you'll find topics that were covered in the podcast as well as others. And that concludes this week's episode. We thank you again for listening, and we hope to have you back here next week at the Hour of History podcast.
Hey, Hour of History podcast fans, have you checked out the Hour of History blog, hourofhistory.com/blog, updated twice a month with new content talking about the trials and tribulations of becoming a historian, as well as some great suggestions for books, movies, and just about everything else under the sun. Hourofhistory.com/blog. Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.